And I'll start with the ligaments. Pick right through the muscle, dig the marrow out and Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And Reade came out to say the man they tried to label the messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer, and knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US printed walking papers, and knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character, that his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. That no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion. Cue those fuckers crawling out the woodwork to come analyze the way you wore your hair and what you wear. Like your appearance waives your rights, or that somehow you're the reason for your situation. Somehow they've decided you should bear responsibility for what such monstrous men insist on doing. Somehow they're deluded by the empty, hypocritical, and useless fucking platitudes that bastard keeps on spewing. And I think it's very telling that the best of their excuses when they try to come and justify our president's abuses is a hearty butt Trump. In which case I'll remind you that you never saw the news attempt to sell us Donald Trump like he was morally upstanding or a decent human. But when Joe says something bigoted or ogles someone's little kid, CNN says, isn't this refreshing? Biden's like a mix of JFK and FDR with all the finer parts of Harry Truman. Christ, I know that they don't think that we're the brightest, but at least pretend we got a couple lumens. Ask yourself if you have ever questioned what they fed you, or do you just shut your eyes and then consume it? And now ask yourself if you ate every one of Biden's lies under guise of harm reduction and the promise of a slight improvement. And now imagine long ago that Biden chose to show you who he really was by traumatizing you for his amusement. Now imagine that you watched him touch a Bible with those filthy hands, and then assume the power of the highest seat in all the land, of knowing your attacker wields a global coalition born of three-letter agencies who'll make a life's mission out of trying to discredit you through lies, damn lies, and collusion. Big tech is never gonna separate from our surveillance state. Fuck's sakes, they're just a breath away from total fusion. So there will come a time where even if you see the light, your voice will never reach the sky through all the bots and all the noise pollution. So trust us when we tell you that the masking of abuses is perhaps this country's oldest institution. And I know nothing nobler than facing it in honor of the truth when you know that the people holding power have been neutralizing truth since there was wet ink on the Constitution. So know that Tara's truth is something crucial to the movement. And if you see yourself a partner to the revolution, help this country see through all the baseless propaganda through the crux of Joe's illusions. And recognize that Reade gave everything she had so she could tell us what the truth is. Recognize the decent thing to do when someone bears their soul and shows their bruises is not to ask for context or offer up your own solutions. Your job is just to listen with an honest mind and put yourself on Tara's side a moment so you understand the path she chooses. That there is no instant fame worth the dragging of your name. And if that's what you think, you've a lot to learn about the kind of facts the mob can handle and the kind that it refuses. You've a lot to learn about the news and all its many uses. Guess you've yet to learn the truth the news will serve as fruit from which they've squeezed out all the juices. And we all eat the husk and just pretend it's full of nutrients and isn't really useless. But the jaws of our ability to yield accountability are absolutely toothless. So don't you kid yourself that any lips are being loosened. They won't ever tell us where the bodies are or show us where the proof is. It's on you to recognize the lechery our president so regularly oozes. It's on you to muster up some honesty and ask yourself how Biden won your trust, but it's America that loses. Open up your eyes and learn to recognize the bruises. Open up your eyes and learn to recognize the bruises. My lips, brand new taxes, starving all the billionaires and neutering their Visa Maxes. Topple Congress off their axis, mobilize the homeless, give them axes, call it praxis. Chop a couple limbs off the legislative branches. We'll show you the difference between air as a human right and guaranteed oxygen access. Octogenarians who barely know what day it is are culling countless citizens while sitting on a dais made of ignorance that was built on the graves of the slaves made to labor for its self-declared significance, and all to build a Congress full of millionaires who make their fortunes
Welcome back, everyone, to the Politics of Survival. Thank you for joining us. This is a really great show today. It's at a little different time because we wanted to make sure our guest didn't have to get up in the middle of the night to be with us. Mohamed Elmaazi is here. He's an editor and a journalist and has worked on so many stories that concern the world and often are not covered in the mainstream media. So thank you, Mohamed. Thank you so much for joining us and the Politics of Survival.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So one of the things that's on, a lot of people's minds right now is an update with some of the Assange, Julian Assange, things that are going on because he is about to be extradited to the United States under the Espionage Act. And I was reading your piece about this, and you have been to every single one of his arraignments. And could you talk a little bit about that? First of all, what drew you to it as a journalist, and then your commitment to this, bringing this forth to the world.
Okay, yeah. So it's just a slight amendment. We don't know yet if he's going to be extradited. So there's still appeals potentially to the European Court of Human Rights. There's also appeals to the High Court on a whole host of issues which have yet to be addressed or were addressed at the original extradition hearing. But the defense lost on. So it's known as the cross appeal for reasons that really don't matter. It's just a technical label. And that's on issues relating to the impact the case would have on freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the fact that the CIA was said or strongly evidenced to have been spying. In fact, the European Court of Human Rights has recently concluded in a case that was appealed all the way up there that Jennifer Robinson, one of the lawyers on Assange's legal team, and her communications were spied upon, and the British had to accept their involvement in this. So that's lawyer-client privilege. Communications spied upon, fed directly to the CIA, according to 2 whistleblowers working for a security firm. So there's a whole series of issues that have yet to be fully exhausted within the courts in terms of appeals.
And couldn't just the fact that, well, for instance, Mike Pompeo is being, asked to make an appearance in Spanish court because it's been verified that they had a plot to try to assassinate Julian Assange. This is the CIA. Wouldn't that, under the amendment, knock that out, like the validity of any charges for him?
Under which amendment?
Wouldn't it under because first of all, they're not really charging him with anything, right? In Belmarsh, he's being held on remand. Is that correct?
Yes. So the UK authorities are not charging him with anything. He's being held pursuant to a US extradition request. Right. And even though he won at the court of first instance, which had the most detailed levels of evidence and cross-examination, he then that victory was reversed on appeal on the technical ground so the first judge dismissed all the defense arguments, right? Okay. And it's important for people to understand that in the Anglo-American extradition treaty, there is a presumption in favor of extradition, at least of Brits or people in the UK requested by the US government. It's an imbalanced treaty, actually, so it's not as easy for the UK to get people from the United States, but there's a presumption in favor of extradition, and it's down for you as the defendant, as the person being requested, to explain why you fall under an exemption or an exception, why you shouldn't be extradited. It's the onus is on you, right? So it's not a trial, it's just an extradition hearing. And most extradition hearings, they might be done in half a day or maybe a couple of days, depending on their complexity. This thing went on for weeks. And then of course there were months of, administrative and evidential and legal arguments, and then weeks of actual witnesses testifying. So it's quite unusual in that respect. That's not the normal process. And as part of the defense, they argued that Julian shouldn't be extradited for a number of reasons. One, it's a politically motivated prosecution, they said. Right. They argued that there's evidence that the Obama administration, while it is still responsible for setting the series of events that led to Julian having to, or being part of the series of events that led Julian having to flee and obtain asylum at the Ecuadorian Embassy, the indictment did not come out until the Trump administration, and until they leaned even harder on the Brits and Ecuadorians and others to find a deal for him to be dragged out of the embassy in the end and then indicted. And so, and there's also other elements to it as well, why they argue that this is politically motivated. They also argued that the offense itself is a political offense, espionage, which is exempt under the Anglo-American Treaty, which is true, that political offenses are exempt. So but under the UK legislation, it doesn't mention political offenses, so which is confusing, right? So then you have the treaty saying one thing and the legislation not saying anything either way. Then you have the argument that this would violate Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Think of it as sort of our version of the First Amendment, right? Which is supposed to protect, although it's not an absolutist, none of the rights other than the prohibition on torture is absolute, right? And I think perhaps the right not to be the right to life as well. So I think death penalties is off the table now, although it wasn't always. It's the right. There's the right to both receive and impart information, right? So and explicitly that's in Article 10. So that guarantees the right to both give out information and receive information, and the right of a free press. Okay. The fact that lawyer-client privilege, as we said, was violated, spied upon, that shows that the system can't be trusted. The U.S. government can't be trusted in this case, and finally, and there were a number of others, but I'm just giving you an example. Those are many of the kind of rights-based arguments. Some of them were more technical. And then the fact that he's at high risk of suicide because he's on the autism spectrum, because he has a history of suicidal ideation, I think a suicide attempt, clinical depression, suicide in the family, and as well as the treatment that the Americans as well had to accept that he would be subjected to, both pre-trial, right, as well as if he's convicted post-trial for years, even decades, right? Extreme isolation, something called SAMs, special administrative measures, where you have very limited access to the outside world, sort of an even more extreme version of solitary confinement, if you like. And the judge concluded on the evidence that he was a very high risk of suicide, if you factor in all those things. She rejected all the other arguments. And I wrote a piece in Jacobin called something like, "This is a victory for Julian Assange, but still a blow for press freedom," was the headline of the piece. And I try to explain why, even though he won on the suicide risk, it is still a very dangerous decision that she rejected all the other arguments.
Right.
So the Americans appealed it to the High Court. So this was at the magistrate's court. They appealed it to the High Court, and they said, okay, we're going to give assurances that we won't subject him to these conditions that they say will lead to his suicide, unless he says or does something, we're not saying what, in the future that would then lead us to do it. So there's a huge caveat there already with the assurances, and amazingly, the High Court accepted it. So the High Court said the judge was in her remit. She was within her right to find what she found, that he's at high risk of suicide if he's subjected to extreme isolation, etc. But we're going to accept these assurances that the Americans are now giving us, even though these assurances are massively caveated and they don't include all these other things, because the Americans claim they don't do solitary confinement anyway. Right.
Okay.
So they use terms like administrative segregation and all the rest of it. And the defense was saying, look, there are all these other things which are basically the same thing. It's the extreme conditions that they're talking about holding him in.
Right.
Supreme Court refused to hear any appeal. So now it's with the Home Secretary, who is down to her supposedly imminently to decide now. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, who's a pretty right-wing Home Secretary, one of the most right-wing in my lifetime, definitely, of what is already a right-wing government, unfortunately, pretty right-wing government. Priti Patel is for her to decide, because she now still has to decide, and there's an exemption as well for her, like if it would be oppressive to extradite, something like that. And there's been loads of defense submissions and Nobel Prize winning laureates or Peace Prize winners, etc. And the Bar Council, apparently, I wasn't aware of that till a few days ago, the European Bar Council and or Law Society, European Law Society, basically wrote saying, you know, there's shocking evidence of violation of the attorney-client privilege, which is meant to be sacrosanct. You cannot extradite under these circumstances, and others who've, doctors for Assange, a collection of doctors as well. So there's many people who've written. But whatever her decision is, there's, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but they can potentially legally, there's a process here known as judicial review. And I know you have the same expression or term in the States, but it's a bit different here. Here is just when you challenge the legality of a decision of some authority acting in a public capacity. So that could be the local police department, the local government, local council, central government, a government minister, a regulator, that they've done something or not done something that you're saying is outside of their legal authority. They've violated, which most judges don't like to do anyway, in this country at least, right? They're not fond of saying that you've gone so far as to be, but, you know, I mean, I used to work before as a lawyer in law, and I used to focus on judicial review cases, and you do win lots of cases because they do act so blatantly out of bounds sometimes that, like, even, you know, conservative judges or what have you, they can see it. But beyond that, I mean, that that judicial review would go to the High Court, though. And the High Court are the very people who've just sent the case to Priti Patel. But beyond that, after you've exhausted the domestic vein of that suicide risk case and the assurances, there's a potential appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which are far less blasé about the idea of extraditing somebody to a country where they would be subjected basically to torture and other forms of cruel and human and degrading treatment. And B, there's the cross appeal, that is to say, the appeal on all those grounds they lost on: freedom of speech, politically motivated prosecution, et cetera, that they lost at the magistrate's court. to then appeal those ones up the system as well. So that's where we're at, where while we're waiting for Priti Patel to make her decision, and she's supposed to within a week, but she can renew it for another month. It seems, according to the rules, in perpetuity, right? So she can say, I want another month, I want another month. Now, on a certain level.
Do you just feel like on some level that this is just a slow motion execution on the US's part? Like he's suffering, and he's in one of the harshest prisons in the world in England right now, the Belmarsh.
Yeah, but Belmarsh is referred to, has been historically known as, at least over the last 20 years, Britain's Guantanamo, things like that. So yeah, it's not a nice place. It's a place where people convicted of very serious offenses get sent.
He's an Australian citizen. He's not even a US citizen. So I have never, I mean, just that alone should tell people a lot. And he also is the first journalist, editor, publisher to be in this position for publishing. It wasn't his materials. He published materials.
Right. So that is important for people to understand, is what's happening. Some people that may not understand is that you have, so the charges pertain, right? There's 17 charges under the Espionage Act and another one under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is constantly and erroneously referred to by far too many news outlets as a hacking charge. It's not a hacking charge. Yeah. That is where, I'll just do that one first. That's a potential 5-year prison sentence there was a conversation allegedly between Chelsea Manning and someone from WikiLeaks. So let's assume the government, the indictment is assuming that's Julian. And Chelsea Manning is saying, hey, can you help me crack this password hash? And the person who they're saying is Julian comes back and he says, let me take a look. And then he comes back, this 2010 or 2009. He comes back and says, no, sorry, I can't help you. So that conversation is being argued as that's conspiracy to commit computer intrusion, right? So can you imagine if you had like a conversation like that, and then 10 years later, you're being charged with conspiracy and face up to 5 years. And that is what we're constantly being told is a hacking charge. And the thing is, the government was saying this would be necessary to help Chelsea Manning hide her identity as the whistleblower. So the defense argued, A, it's legitimate for journalists to help sources protect their identity. Right. And B, they even brought a U.S. military expert who concluded, no, this is not what it would have been done. It is consistent with their argument that actually this was just about accessing a computer, like an entertainment website that is blocked to U.S. service personnel. And Chelsea Manning was apparently known as the go-to person by some of her colleagues to get like music and games and what have you. And this cracking this password hash would have helped her access the site. It's sort of like when you had a workplace and they ban Facebook, they block Facebook and other sites. Right. So the U.S. military had and it was amazing because there was like very little mention to this report. The judge is like, well, that's a matter for trial, right? The 17 other charges are all under the Espionage Act, and they all basically say it is a crime punishable for each count up to 10 years in prison to possess or receive national defense information, right? That's, I think, is how it's worded, national defense documents or national defense information. So it's like, okay, but that's what journalists do all the time. And there is nothing in the Espionage Act, which was written over 100 years ago, about journalism. There's no public interest defense. You don't have to prove harm. You don't have to prove espionage. You don't have to prove other states being involved. You don't have to prove anything. It's a strict liability offense that he's being charged with. So it's literally, did you receive the Iraq war logs? Yes. Okay, guilty. That's 10 years. Did you receive these other documents? Yes, guilty. 10 years. If you try to say, as Daniel Ellsberg did when he was being prosecuted, and Daniel Ellsberg was not a publisher, he was a whistleblower, and he had actually signed official secrets documents. Julian Assange wasn't even in the United States. He didn't sign anything. He's not a U.S. citizen. He never agreed to be bound by U.S. state secrecy laws. He's a publisher and an editor based outside of the U.S., and they're seeking to use a 100-year-old draconian espionage law that was actually primarily used against people who argued against the U.S. joining the First World War. That was so even though it was drafted under the guise of protecting against German espionage, I think around 3,000 Americans were tried, arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for calling out against U.S. involvement in the First World War, including Eugene Debs, the head of the Socialist Party. He actually was imprisoned for a speech which he gave, which people can read. It's a famous speech where he basically says, working class people do most of the killing and the dying. Therefore, it should be up to us, working class people, to decide whether or not we're going to go to war or not. And this is a banker's war, right? And there are reasons why they said that actually America's involvement was a banker's war, because bankers had loaned money to various sides on the opposite of the Germans. And then it looked like they might end up losing. He was imprisoned for that speech. And it went all the way to the federal Supreme Court on the basis that, no, this is a violation of the First Amendment. And they lost. And all of them lost. 3,000 people had their convictions affirmed. And that was before Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis and all of them, who confirmed the convictions. And that's where the expression comes from. Freedom of speech does not allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater. It's not about a case of someone yelling fire in a crowded theater. It's a case of people saying, we should not join this war. Don't, resist being drafted if you get drafted, and people being prosecuted and convicted for that. That was the fire. So it's people may not realize the extent to which if you look at the history of the First Amendment, it's not as rosy in terms of its interpretation and application as perhaps we're led to believe. Is my point, including ahead.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a lot of overreach to pull an Australian citizen who is not a U.S. citizen alone. Just that technical fact alone.
The extraterritorial application of U.S. criminal law against a publisher for publishing factual information. And that's it. And in the Ellsberg case, he was not permitted when he tried to say, this is what the document said about the Vietnam War. And this is why I published them. Every time I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg, I compared his case to Julian Assange. Right. I said on World Press Freedom Day, Julian Assange remains in Belmarsh is the headline. And that's with the Canary. That's from this time last year.
You know what? And I have your article. If I can post it. Hey, Reef, do you have that article you can put up, please? So that our audience can get it. So you wrote the article that you're just describing, really illustrated your point that the difference between the two cases and also the application now. Now I have a question. Now I have a lot of, I'm not a practicing lawyer.
The one you've got on, sorry, go on.
Oh, go
the
ahead.
One you've got on the screen, that's at the Dissenter. That's about Amnesty International's refusal to designate Julian a prisoner of conscience. That's the most recent one. The one I referred to, that's from last year, but I can send you the link. It's fine. Go on with the question.
Can you talk? Oh, I'm sorry. Really quick. Can you tell me if Obama's expansion of the Espionage Act has any impact on this case or not? Or are they relying on this antiquated, interpretation of the 100-year-old law?
Well, okay. So let's see.
Because Obama expanded, as you know.
Yeah, so the Obama had expanded the use of it, basically. So the Nixon administration, as far as I'm aware, is the first administration to use the Espionage Act against a whistleblower, two whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg and somebody else he worked with, right? And the only reason that case failed, as I note in the interview, is because of all the illegality that was exposed during the trial that got to the judge's attention. I mean, they broke into his psychiatrist's office to find material to blackmail him with various right-wing Cuban Miamins, who I'm pretty sure are linked to Watergate as well, and possibly the assassination of JFK. That's another story. But I don't know if you know of the link between the plumbers and anyway, that's a whole nother story that people can look into. They can read The Devil's Chessboard by Talbot. And so, and in the end, I think L. Rickman, who is, what was his position in the Nixon administration? I can't remember what his cabinet position was, but he apparently had gone to the judge at one point when it looked like the case was going to fall apart, and said, we'll make you FBI director. Nixon will appoint you FBI director if you keep this case going. And amazingly, because they knew this is something he wanted to be FBI director, apparently. And amazingly, this judge ended up saying, okay, this case has been poisoned beyond repair. People can go and find the very small quote. And he just dismisses the case. But had it not been for that, the case would have continued and he would have had no defense, because whenever he tried to speak on the stand to say, this is why I did what I did, the prosecution got up and said, objection, his motivations are irrelevant. And the judge would say, sustained, right? There is no, intent. This is a strict liability offense. There's what you intended. It doesn't matter.
And this is why Edward Snowden, excuse me for interrupting, but this is exactly why Edward Snowden will not want to come back to the United States to deal with.
He's charged under the same laws in the same district, the Eastern District of Virginia, originally by the same prosecutor, I think, as well, which is the same district where Julian Assange is charged. Eastern District of Virginia is where the only employers are the national security states. Nobody else lives there, or family members of people who work there, or retirees of people who work there. CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, the Pentagon, various mercenary or private military contractor firms, whatever you want to call them, and various other like Lockheed Martin type places. And that's it. Nobody else lives there for any other reason. So that's where his jury's coming from. So it's a jury. It is like a court which has 100% conviction rate when it comes to the Espionage Act cases. So
and as you may know, I had Maria Butina on my show early on. Yeah. And she discussed just why she took the guilty plea for a technicality of not registering, because a jury trial, she was, it just wouldn't have worked, and kind of the same reason. So, but she described the harsh prison. He would be going to the same facility that Maria Butina was in, and she described being held in solitary and all the.
What was that? ADX stuff. Florence, or apparently,
and she described horrific kind of experiences with solitary and other things. And then there's a good article that and I'm forgetting, I'm sorry, the outlet I'm blanking, but it's The Spy Who Wasn't. In other words, they kind of went through and kind of showed how she was just kind of thrown under the bus. But go on with what you were saying as far as like how this expansion kind of.
Yes. So Nixon, so originally, so this is supposedly about defending against espionage, but was primarily used, more used against people during Woodrow Wilson's time who opposed First World War involvement than anyone else. Like I said, 3,000 convictions. Then it kind of like gets mothballed, this law, if you like. Not mothballed, but kind of forgotten about. Maybe it's used a couple times against people who are actually maybe selling state secrets. Right. And then Nixon uses it against Ellsberg and what's his name? This other guy. Then with Ellsberg, it's wrong that I can't remember his name, but I apologize.
Okay, it's okay.
Then a couple decades later, Obama is president, and you've got a number of whistleblowers from the Bush era, and it's going into the Obama era. So like Bill Binney from the NSA. Oh, there was somebody else whose name.
Daniel Hale reported about the drones, 90%.
Daniel Hale, that's much more recent though. Daniel Hale, that's under Obama. So I think if I recall, Daniel Hale under Obama or Trump. Okay. That's Obama. So you had a couple who were blowing the whistle during the Bush era. Then Obama comes in, supposedly on a Hope and Change platform. Well, not supposedly, on a Hope and Change platform. And he himself is a constitutional law professor. I remember lots of people made a big deal about that.
Yes.
When I was pointing out, I was like, yeah, but most members of Congress are lawyers. It's normal in the US and in Britain for many members of Congress or of the legislature to have law degrees. Right. But anyway, he then ends up, him and Eric Holder, the Attorney General, who was assistant AG under Clinton previously. So loads of the Obama people come from the Clinton administration, previous Clinton administration. And they end up ratcheting up. They use the Espionage Act more often to go after whistleblowers than all other presidents combined. And that's partially misleading statistics simply because very few previous presidencies had actually used the Espionage Act to go after leakers and whistleblowers. Does that make sense? So he just took that and he expanded it massively. And they also started to target journalists as well and threatened them, with these kind of these charges hanging over their head. If Julian is actually taken over to the United States, he will and is prosecuted, he'll be the very first publisher that is prosecuted under the Espionage Act for publishing documents that were leaked to them, not under the basis that they stole them or hacked them, simply for receiving and obtaining documents without authorization.
So does
which is
bring
shocking.
every single journalist, regardless of the outlet, under scrutiny if this is the kind of precedent that they're trying to set here with this case?
Well, as a matter of precedent, if you're able to prosecute and convict them for publishing documents leaked to them, then you can do that to anybody, US citizen or not. Okay, granted, they're trying to argue that because he's not a US citizen, he's not entitled to protections under the First Amendment. They explicitly argued that. in
But
court.
he shouldn't be called in anyway. That's
Yeah, but he
that's
should be
the
subjected
circle.
to criminal laws.
Oh
The
my
thing about how
God.
Kafkaesque that is.
Yeah.
So we're basically saying
Yes.
our lies, our
It's a
criminal
catch
laws
22.
apply to you outside of the United States, or you can be prosecuted outside for things that you've done outside of the United States, but you don't get the protections under the First Amendment. I would guess that a judge would not accept that argument,
Right.
because it's pretty settled. But it
It's
wouldn't
absurd.
matter, because I told you the draconian nature of the Espionage Act wouldn't
Mhm.
really matter, because unless a judge goes against however 100 years of precedent in terms of applying the Espionage Act, they're going to say it doesn't matter. You don't have, there's no public interest defense, there's no journalistic defense, there's
Right.
no, right? So
Mhm.
I mean, he could be convicted, and then it could be a whole series of appeals.
Right.
But first of all, look at the courts of who the judges that are in court right now. I mean, it's a pretty reactionary sets of judges, loads of them in the federal system and going up to the Supreme Court. Second of all, like, this could take years and years, and he could end up being suicided while in prison, right? In the United States. So it's the key thing is no one should have to be subjected to this prosecution on this basis on the first place. How would you like it if you publish something based on hacked or leaked documents that were, or you, when I mean you, I mean the general viewer,
Right.
what have you,
Right.
American, from the Chinese state, say, exposing Chinese alleged or real Chinese abuses, and then you're traveling to a country with an extradition treaty with China, and then all of a sudden you find yourself under arrest for violating Chinese espionage laws, facing up to 170 years in prison, which is what Julian faces in terms of the maximum. So that is the reality of what's going on. People just don't seem to fully grasp that. They think it's got to do with the DNC or the 2016 election. Some of them seem to think of that because of the nature of the reporting for the last few years implied that heavily, but it has got nothing to do with that. Never did. In fact, the Mueller report concluded explicitly they found they had no evidence that could substantiate that WikiLeaks or Julian Assange knew of or was, quote, willfully blind to any conspiracy between Russia, Trump, etc. So their publication of documents, they said they could not. And if you know anything about US conspiracy laws, they are very broad in terms of how they can grab you in. And I wrote a piece at the time saying that the Mueller report said this, but it was redacted. So when it first came out, the public version, okay, the senators saw it, the congressmen who had access to the full version saw it, but it wasn't until they were sued and forced by a court to unredact, because you didn't know what was redacted. You just knew something was redacted. Then when it was unredacted, they only unredacted it months later after losing in court on the eve of the US presidential election, when of course nobody cared, like nobody's paying attention. And there was barely any reporting on it. And I wrote a piece, but I wrote it at Sputnik at the time. And of course, Sputnik being partially funded by Russian foreign ministry, I think it's the foreign ministry, at least indirectly, and ads. Now people can't even see it. They'd have to use like a VPN. Perhaps Americans can, but in this country,
you can
Sputnik
see,
is blocked.
You can see Sputnik. It is censored. I used to write opinion pieces for RT. You can still find them on Odyssey and Rumble. Unfortunately, the censorship has gotten to the point where there's really no balance to the narrative in the Western lens. And in England, I know that they pulled RT's license completely. Which is, the legality of that, I'm not sure.
In France, they did that too. In fact, in France, they used an emergency. They had only just renewed it, concluded it could be renewed, but then Ukraine happened, and basically, war justifies everything, right? Like during a time period of war, it's like, well, this is and don't get me wrong, you can justify all kinds of things if you're facing an existential threat, but they're not really. This is just being used as an excuse. France is not at risk. If anything, you should see the speeches from Macron saying, the Russians have their own interests that we have to be prepared to negotiate with. We have to avoid escalation. France and Germany are typically the two countries which kind of push back a little bit against the constant anti-Russia pushes, right? I don't know if Americans know this, but they are the two countries because how they perceive what is in their own national interest is different than how Moldova will or how Britain will or the US will. Sometimes there's things appear to the average person as though there's unanimity, like we're all on the same page. But the more you look into things, the more you realize that they're not exactly. Well, I mean, when it comes to selling weapons,
selling weapons, exactly.
They are on the same
40 billion. Yeah, that's sailed right through the Congress. So one of the things I wanted to talk with you about too is just in general. Julian Assange is the representative of a I think a war against journalists, right? A real investigative journalist. And I'm not talking about stenographers, for the corporate media, but I'm talking about work that you do, work that others do, where you do expose valid war crimes and do present a different narrative through a different lens, rather than just sort of this myopic Western military industrial complex kind of drive. Hopefully we'll get to a point where more independent content creators are lifted and billionaires just don't have a stranglehold on the corporate media. But one of the things that's really been startling has been in the amount of journalists killed, imprisoned, sanctioned, demonetized. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Palestine, if you could, because your body of work includes a lot of different subject matter. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I was going to show you the Abby Martin clip when she confronted Blinken.
Okay, so you want us to speak first, or do you want to do the Abby Martin clip first?
Do you want to do that? Let's do the clip. Let's do the clip first, Reif, if you have it up, and then we can get your reaction. And then Reif, he needs to be able to hear it. So, reaction.
Well, Abby Martin is correct that Palestine, historic Palestine, that includes both the state of Israel, right, within the apartheid state, if you like, and also within the occupied Palestinian territories, what's left of historic Palestine, which is also an apartheid system, if you like, is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists, both Palestinian and non-Palestinian alike, British, American, including, not that this should matter, but, white, Anglo, middle class Brits and Americans, press people, sometimes having press helmet, as Shireen did, who was wearing both a bulletproof vest, which had press, and she was with a gaggle of other press there at the entrance of Jenin camp. Does not always protect you. Sometimes it increases the likelihood that you'll be targeted. So even CNN, as Abby had noted, had their own investigation where they looked at various footage at the time. I mean, originally they went along with the kind of mainstream sort of narrative of, one of them was like ludicrous. What was it? Like bullet meets journalist, resulting in
found a bullet.
Passing.
Found a bullet. Yeah.
Yeah. Blinken had said something about it's quite sad about her passing. Isn't passing what happens when you're in bed surrounded by your family, not when your face is blown out because somebody, a sniper, shot you. Yeah. And where between the space between the vest and the helmet, because she's wearing a helmet, so in that space over there she was shot, right, which is by apparent sniper. So there were no apparent clashes. There were people there sitting, joking, laughing, because she's such a well-known journalist, has been for 25 years. She's known throughout the Middle East as a common face there. As I don't know what would be the equivalent. I don't know that there would be an equivalent in the United States.
Yeah, maybe our older media, like Walter Cronkite, right?
Yeah, or what's that? The female one. The female one.
It's okay.
Sounds very technical, biological, like I'm an alien. The female one, married to George Stephanopoulos, who was a former White House correspondent. Then he ended up having a thing on CNN. She was
Right.
CNN correspondent for a while,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So who's
Sort of the face, but yeah, Shireen, like everybody knew who she was. She'd been, really bringing, correct truth about what was going on, and one of the few journalists that were in that area were able to get through.
Yeah. What? I'm sorry. No, that's not.
No,
That's
no.
not who I was thinking of. No, although if you type in married to George Stephanopoulos, I'm sure it'll pop up.
Yeah.
But on average, 2 journalists a year are killed by the state of Israel.
Wow.
Since from 2000 to now, if you were to average it out, between 45 journalists were killed during this time period, according to Palestinian Ministry of Information figures, and 55 according to the Palestinian Journalists Union. So they say it's a bit higher. So Yusuf Abu Hussein was killed in 2021, Ahmed Abu Hussein in 2018, 2014 saw plenty actually. Muhammad Ali Ahmed Al-Kumi, 2012. You have, I don't know if people remember, only last year, the Associated Press building was bombed by the state of Israel in Gaza. They blew it up. They gave people 10 minutes to evacuate. They phoned them up. You've got 10 minutes to evacuate. Then they blew up the entire building. Middle East Eye and also Al Jazeera also used that building.
And there was no international consequences for that. None. Like there was a little bit of press.
Can you imagine if it was Russia doing that?
Yeah.
Even if it was 10 years ago, would be reminded, it would be commemorated every year, right? And if the Russians did something like that, we should be reminded about it. It's just interesting that how quickly it fades from memory, and even just the nature of the wording of the reporting. Like I said, like bullet meets head, bullet and journalists meet, like ships passing in the night.
It just,
So this is, it is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. Journalists are regularly targeted. Radio outlets have been bombed. They know, I mean, you have to understand something. The state of Israel has like mapped up practically every alleyway, every building, every corner. They have assets and spies everywhere because they can blackmail people, because the amount, their prison population is quite high, where they just grab people and then imprison them, men, women, children, for days, weeks, months, sometimes years, including journalists. There are at least 10, 15 journalists currently detained in Israel. Not nearly as many as in Turkey, another U.S. ally, NATO partner, engaged in massive ethnic cleansing and literal genocide operations in northern Iraq against Kurds in northern Iraq and northern Syria, which is a whole nother story. But they also have a massive imprisoning of journalists there. I mean, the level of violence by the state of Turkey against journalists and against Kurds and organized labor and leftist groups. And there's a strong relationship between Israel and Turkey going back to their founding, actually. That's a very strong relationship, one of their best sort of partners, as it were. Israel bombed Al-Aqsa TV office in 2014. 45 minutes later, they bombed Al-Aqsa radio office. So it's, that was in Gaza City. So it's not unusual for them to target journalists, and the amount injured is over 1,000, right? So recently. So yeah, I think according to one report, they're detaining 11. There's 11 in detention, including, basic rights not being satisfied according to various monitors in terms of abuse and conditions and what have you. So they know what is where. The reason I was talking about their mass surveillance that the Israelis have there. And it's important for people to know that, until recently, the state of Israel didn't exist, right? And the reason why I mention that is because it is a settler colonial state. Now, they didn't invent racism. They didn't invent settler colonialism or ethno-nationalism. Zionism is an ethno-nationalist ideology. In fact, many of its supporters, I've read academic articles saying not all ethno-nationalism is bad, right? Because obviously they're arguing from people should read it to see how these things are how they will try to, basically, if it's Jewish ethno-nationalism in historic Palestine, then apparently it's good, right? Or if it's Azov Battalion,
right? If it's neo-Nazi, it's
if it's literal fascist, like literal fascists, where they have like SS signs on their tanks and on their uniforms, and will they explicitly explicit now? If you tweet something about that, you can end up having your tweet lost.
Well, and you know, I had Ava Bartlett just the other day on the stream live from Ukraine, and she's on a Ukraine military kill list. And she has an American passport and a Canadian passport. She's an international journalist, as you know, and she has been basically, neither government's really helping her. Mainstream media is not covering the story that she's on this kill list. She's in the Ukraine right now on the ground and reporting. And how frightening to not have protection from your own government or support for the truth that you're trying to bring, because she's just simply not reporting State Department talking points, right? She's actually reporting what she's seeing and objective truth. And I think, you know, what's really startling about it is that this kill list isn't just like some, you know, computer website. This was deemed by the US State Department as a terrorist website a few years ago. And 2 to 3 journalists have been killed or disappeared already on that website. So they print her picture, her address, any kind of personal information they can. And it's frightening. She's still doing the work. And I commend you and other journalists that are pushing through, risking your freedom, risking your financial freedom, because they'll put sanctions on you as well in some countries now, including the US. And, you know, trying to just bring truth, right? It's horrible.
It is not a good time for journalists. And I think one of the reasons that matters is because, you know, where do most people get their information from? It's via secondary sources. And so when you have, in some places, find they're killed, in other places they're detained, in other places a message is sent by, you know, there's the national security bill being pushed through Parliament right now by Priti Patel, no less.
Right. I was going to ask you earlier about the timing of that, because the timing is right during this discussion about whether Assange is extradited or not.
Yes. And also, actually, this first came out during the Snowden and other revelations when David Cameron's government, so previous conservative Tory right-wing government, had ordered a review into the Official Secrets Act laws, right? Because the laws are already pretty draconian, but they're looking at beefing up. I mean, basically, okay, it's under the guise of espionage, like the US Espionage Act, right? So there were some groups breathing a sigh of relief on Twitter. I'd never heard of them, but apparently they're like serious groups. One of them for whistleblowers, and the other called the Freedom of Information Campaign. They're like, oh, we were expecting something much worse that was focusing on journalism, but this just seems to be focusing on espionage. I was like, okay, well, you read, so it basically criminalizes the release, the obtaining the release, unauthorized release or dissemination of any restricted information. So they expand the definition of what you can be prosecuted for, just any restricted information.
Wow.
And then they're like, oh, but so, and the fine, so it's either
it's criminalizing speech. Yeah. Go on.
It's either a fine. I mean, they could say, well, we need to protect against people leaking official documents. And the punishment is either a fine or life in prison. Not a fine up to life in prison, because that's not how it would be worded, right? You have to say, or any sentence between, like, you know, 1 day in prison up to life or what have you. No. So either the judge, upon conviction, he or she either gets to fine you or imprison you for life. Those are the two options for the judge. That's as the law is written. Wow. And there's a foreign condition component. So this is only if the foreign power condition is satisfied. That's why these groups had initially said, oh, well, it's fine because there's a foreign power condition. So this is about espionage. But when you read through the foreign power condition, you find that, and I'm going to write a piece about this for Consortium News. Basically, you find that there's many ways for it to be satisfied. If it can be shown or argued before a jury, I suppose, convince a jury that your role in this somehow was with the intent to serve the interests of, or to the benefit of, a foreign power, then they've satisfied the foreign power condition, right? And also, we don't need to name, it says, the state, the prosecutor, doesn't need to even identify the foreign power. So, so it's like, okay, well, so you could still get a trial. So, you know, there is no proof. There's nothing to do with espionage then. right? They're just saying if
Right.
you had the intent. So now we get to argue before a jury, well, look, he's published an RT and he's written articles elsewhere saying NATO is bad, and NATO has a role to play in conflict, starting conflict, including Ukraine, that NATO has a role. This sounds like the kind of thing that is written for the benefit of a foreign power. And if you can have like a pretty hysterical environment, you could have a jury saying like, yeah, that does sound like that, especially when they are bombarded of every corner from BBC to the Guardian to the Daily Mail of evil Putin has invaded just because he wants to genocide Ukraine, and that's it, because he wants a new Russian empire, and that's it. There's no alternative, there's no other piece of the puzzle, what have you. So if they satisfy that, and that's deemed to satisfy the foreign power condition, well, now you're facing an unlimited fine or life in prison. So I remember when I read through that, I was like, how can these, like, okay, they seem to have maybe understood a bit more now, because there's an article by a colleague in the Dissenter about this, where there's a better quote than the initial quotes they were putting out on Twitter, right? Because the original quotes on Twitter, and I replied to them. I'm like, have you actually read this? What? There's another one that says, if in part any of the activity alleged was done by a foreign power, then the foreign power condition is satisfied. So it's like, okay, what if the government alleges that the documents that you've published were hacked by the FSB? Okay. Should that matter? I mean, look at all the stuff being published about Russia right now.
Right.
I'm sure the CIA has a role in hacking
the biolabs, all of that, the American biolabs.
So when you have stuff, no, but I mean about like emails of government ministry, there's all kinds of Russian government documents being like hacked and dumped. I'm sure the CIA and MI6 and GCHQ and NSA have a role in that. So if I publish some stuff on that, can I be prosecuted in Russia now as a spy using this law? This is the kind of thing as in a version of this law. So what if I publish something in RT and they say, well, RT is partially funded by the Russian state. So therefore, a foreign power is now involved in an element of this offense. So man who works at a government department leaks to me document. I publish document refer to it in my RT article, or they leak to you. I read your article, I republish on my article what your article says about a leaker who leaked to you. I republish on a website funded by some other foreign state in some way, like the BBC is foreign funded, is British state funded, right? So Al Jazeera is funded by the Qatari government, right? France 24 is funded by the French state, right? And so on and so forth. Telesur by a number of different governments in Latin America. And then you have the Chinese state and the Iranian state and the British, like many governments have channels which are funded. Deutsche Welle, funded in part by the German state. So if I publish an article then an RT critical that reveals that's based on things that have been leaked even to somebody else, what's to stop the prosecutor then from saying, okay, well, the foreign power condition has been satisfied. There's a foreign power involved. That's the Russian foreign ministry or whatever partially funds RT. And you've been acting then. And they only have to say they knew or ought reasonably to have known that it might be harmful to UK national interests. What does that even mean? Oh, they're removing the element where you actually have to prove harm, merely that it might be harmful to UK national interests.
Oh, that's really key.
So there's all kinds of things
without that element is so key though, because if you don't have to prove harm, that just means a government that doesn't like what you're saying. Basically, so that is criminalizing speech in a way. So
that's like the Espionage Act being used to prosecute Julian. You don't have to prove harm,
right? So this act, I know England was debating it last week. Has there been any movement? Do you know of yet, or have you not seen what's happening with it? How?
No, I haven't seen any further developments. There is and Richard Spencer did a good job at the Dissenter, so people should check out the piece on that. There is I don't want to say bipartisan because it's more than one party, a tripartisan support, right? There is a cross-party, there you go, that's the word I was looking for, cross-party support in Parliament, of course, with the minority voices against it, but from the Labour to the Liberal Democrats saying we need to rush this through. We need to rush this through to protect us from Russian disinformation. It's like, really? So all the laws we've got on the books aren't enough. Britain was involved in First World War, Second World War. We have all kinds of draconian laws. We have one new terrorist law on average every year. right?
Right.
16, 17 new terrorist acts or versions of it, updates to it over the last 20 years. There's practically one every year where they expand their powers, their surveillance powers, the amount of time they can put you in prison without charge, et cetera, the things they can do. So it makes this is exactly the type of law you don't want rushed through Parliament. That should be debated. Why is there no, if this isn't about targeting journalism, they could very easily have a caveat saying nothing in this bill should be used to target journalists for engaging in journalism
or whistleblower protection
or
act
whistleblowers. Yeah, exactly.
Something like
whistleblowers or journalists, but there is nothing to protect either whistleblowers or journalists. There's no public interest defense whatsoever. There's no defense. So it's so this is the overall environment and the context of what's happening. This is what happens when people don't pay attention and they just assume that forces other than themselves will successfully push back against, there is a natural inclination or drive towards powerful interests acquiring more power. It's just the natural way of things. And whenever you have any kind of loss, it really irritates you. You're like, what? I shouldn't have lost that case, even though you win 1,000 others. Right. So they powerful interests I've found get quite vindictive and irritated. They think they should lose never. Right. Or if they do lose, they should lose when they're going against Pfizer from some regulatory case and Pfizer wins. That's okay, because those are the people who are meant to win in the system. Right. So it's major businesses. I mean, I just pick Pfizer out of
I know. It's any major corporation. I wanted to check in with Reif. Reif, did we have any questions or comments for Mohamed right now that you saw? Some comments or something you want to share? So we're waiting for Reif to look that up. And while he does, the other thing I wanted to, that's okay.
I had my mic muted. Yeah, other than like some great discussions and great shows. I think Andy said Siggy was also lying early on in the show when talking about Assange's case. I think he means the one that said he was lying himself, right? That his witness testimony was not correct.
Oh, the
Thor.
Yeah.
Right. We kind of covered that. Yeah.
And Andrea Mitchell is who Indy thought we were talking about earlier.
Andrea Mitchell. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's the journalist, Mohamed, that we were talking about. Andrea Mitchell. That was married to Stephanopoulos.
But otherwise, you're good.
Okay, great. So Mohamed, what I'd like to do now is, because it went by really too fast, our talk about ways that people can support your work and find you, because you write for many of the same outlets that a lot of us like to read, because for instance, the Grayzone is coming out with some great reporting, and I know you're linked with them as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, although it's been a while since I've published anything with them, but Kit is doing great work. Ironically, I was previously a few years ago publishing with Max about the Integrity Initiative when Kit was on his own beat, also looking at that. And now he's there he's publishing numerous articles with the Grayzone. It's been a while for me. We have noticed, by the way, that a conversation between Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal has been removed from YouTube. Then I was telling Max earlier that it had returned. Yeah, it returned, and he's like, oh, it has returned. And then while I was listening to it, it was removed again. So and Spotify, he showed me a screenshot that Spotify had removed the same discussion, but I still have it on Spotify, so I'm trying to finish it before it gets removed from my Spotify as well.
Yeah, we've all been experiencing
piece,
that.
I think.
Yeah, we've been.
Yes, it was about that. Mason Gate. It was about the Mason Gate story. People should check out that story. There's not enough time to. And the thing is, I know about. I've been following Paul Mason for a while.
We have a couple minutes to talk about that. If you want to talk about it, let's talk about it a little bit. If the audience doesn't know about it.
Okay, Paul Mason, former leftist. I mean, according to him, so let's take him at face value for a moment. In the 80s, he was like a communist, Marxist, or what have you.
Right.
Then kind of became, I suppose, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lots of people sort of shifted or became more liberal, if you like. It's sort of like there is no alternative kind of experience, right? So there's just capitalism. So he became, I think he'd call himself a radical liberal, but frankly, I'm not sure what's that radical about him, because he ended up working for Channel 4, which is a state-funded outlet here. The more progressive state-funded outlet, and he also ended up working for BBC. And
Kind of the
he came.
boutique left.
Yes, well, and he came to prominence because he did a 4-part documentary when he left BBC. He did his own indie kind of documentary looking at Syriza, when the leftist party, when they came into power in Greece, which is worth watching. I that's how I came to know him, even though he'd been around for a while. And the thing is, he has been pretty consistently pro-NATO, pro-military industrial complex. He even wrote a strange article once sort of saying, arguing that political policing in Britain doesn't exist anymore. But he was attacking the spying and the criticism of Corbyn at the time. But in doing so, he was basically saying that political policing, which is the infiltration of political groups, legal groups here, and spying on them, and that doesn't happen anymore, which is not true at all. Actually, there's been multiple massive scandals. They've admitted the Met Police to spying on over 1,000 groups here since the 1960s. Infiltrating police officers, fathering children with environmentalists, activists, and others without them realizing that they're already married with children and that they're actually police, right? They think they're also activists. I mean, real sick, twisted stuff. And this isn't like because they're preventing a suicide bombing or something like that. They're infiltrating non-violent groups, which are just because they're anti-war or they're like critical of McDonald's or like literally things like that. So that's a whole. So he's also, Mason, it turns out, has been having private discussions with people about trying to get the the UK government and others cut out sort of like quasi intelligence outfits or like Bellingcat type places, like Bellingcat, they explicitly mentioned,
Bellingcat, yeah,
to as part of like a propaganda op against the Grayzone and others. And there's this crazy pie chart. It's not a pie chart, this web of different names of people like Jeremy Corbyn, who's like a progressive leader who he was supposedly in favor of when he was leader of the Labour Party, at the center of this spider's web. And there's one section that says Black community and then Muslim community, right? So just one. And then these various lefty kind of news outlets, and the Grayzone is there. And it's all about, we need to find a way essentially to kind of undermine the Grayzone and people who are spreading Putin talking points and Kremlin talking points, that's what they say, etc. So it's a sort of quite an unhinged, almost, I hate to use the term conspiracy theorist, but it's like, it's amazing that they seem to actually almost believe what it is that they're saying. And to what end as well? I'm not quite sure, right? Like, and supposedly from the left, but bear in mind, he's not technically a socialist anymore, right? Anyway, so he's just vaguely of that left-ish space. I mean, he's to the left of Margaret Thatcher, I suppose, right? But that doesn't really mean very much. So it's almost funny, the discussion that there was between Aaron and Max, and also there on the Jimmy Dore show. That was quite funny, that discussion about this reporting that Kit was a part of at the Grayzone. Right. And that YouTube discussion, which was about 2 hours long, which was in part about this and in part about other things, that got pulled by YouTube, then returned about a couple hours ago, then pulled again for violating community standards or what have you, apparently for bullying and harassment.
Well, if you've ever worked in any kind of campaign or whatever, like, I mean, you know, in like in the United States, for instance, they use almost a military kind of like attack from all sides. And the way I kind of analyze this is it's the ruling class has basically decided to shut down independent voices that aren't linked to a particular corporate entity or billionaire that's supporting, you know, the status quo, right? So how you come at them is like what they're doing right now to the Grayzone. You infiltrate there's way the propaganda campaign using buzzwords like Russophobia type buzzwords, that it's Kremlin related, blah, 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 to try to touch on people's, you know, emotions. And then of course you have the tactic of demonetizing, which is happening to a lot of independent journalists,
PayPal,
and banning them from PayPal. Yeah. So has that,
that was done to WikiLeaks years ago, and now it's done to Consortium News, done to Mint Press News. I know anti-war has had .com has had all kinds of like issues, including I think investigations going back years and years, issues that they've had, which is, you know, that's another great website. So
my podcast, my podcast was pulled down from Spotify and Google the same day as Lee Camp's. And then Abby Martin lost all her work. Hopefully she's regained it, that she did from RT, because they pulled all of that from the YouTube. And the YouTube and and for you, I mean, where do you see? Okay, so I want to end on a note, because I know we're going a little over time, and that's okay. People that are with us, right? Right now watching. where can we find your work? And then on the last kind of, I want to have you do the last word on where we can go from here as citizens, like what we can do. Is there any solution, or are we sort of just caught up in this net of the ruling class just controlling information?
Well, that last one is that's a bit hard.
Yeah.
I'm right now trying to keep everything in the day and just focus on the day. And yeah, obviously things can be done. You know, the more people are in groups, I find historically there's greater success in. That's why in groups of people and coalitions of people, rather than people working as individuals. I mean, if you can only work as an individual on your own little bits, then that's fair enough. But and it is difficult because you have personality clashes, ideological clashes, and sometimes these clashes are very real, right? You know, they can't just be papered over. But sometimes people can say, what are our differences? Let's set them aside, you know, and if our differences aren't so great that we can't work together, then let's try working together at least on these particular issues.
Right.
That's why organized labor has historically been so attacked, because organized labor is you know, one way, if not the primary way and the main way that members of the working class have been able to push back against the managers and the owners, because as an individual there's only so much you can do as a worker, but as hundreds, dozens, thousands, tens of thousands of workers, you have much greater power. In terms of your previous question, so yeah, in terms of where do I publish right now, the Dissenter, Electronic Intifada, Jacobin are the most recent places. I've been doing lots of like background
And you're an
research.
editor as well. You're an editor as
well.
well.
That's of like my blog, where I wanted to turn that to be
Okay.
more the interregnum.net. People want to donate. That's good, because I only get paid per article that I publish wherever it is I happen to publish. So if people decide, I don't typically ask people to like donate. I think there's a Patreon button at the interregnum.net, which is my blog. But what that does do, if people contribute, it allows me to continue to be able to look and research and do the work that I do, because you know, I'm not getting paid for like not working, right? Only for material that I actually publish. So and hopefully a piece soon with consortium news, like I said, on this new national security bill, as it's called, the national security bill being pushed through, but it was really just another attack on whistleblowers and journalists. So hopefully that will be out in the next week or two.
Okay, well, thank you. And, you know, it was an honor to have you on the show. I learned so much, and I know the audience did. And I know people will be able to find you on social media as well. And if people look in our description, your links are there. So thank you everyone for listening. And this was the Politics of Survival. Tomorrow, I have a special show with Igor Lepotinik, who works with Oliver Stone. He's going to be talking about Ukraine Rising and some of his films. Igor is an amazing director and producer. And so check that out. We'll be on tomorrow night, 6 p.m. live Pacific time. So Mohamed, thank you so much. And, you know, we really appreciate the work that you do is so important. So we will continue to support everything that you do and share your articles. So take care.
Thank you.
All right, there you have it, everyone. See you next time. Thank you.